The morning mist hung low over the Kenai River, obscuring the tops of the spruce trees that lined its banks. Dan Porter adjusted his wool cap and pulled his waders up a little higher. At 60 years old, his movements weren't as fluid as they once were, but they carried the confidence of a man who had spent most of his life on the water. The late September chill in Alaska's Kenai Peninsula cut through his weathered skin, but Dan barely noticed. This was his element, the gentle rush of water against his legs, the weight of his fishing rod in his calloused hands, the promise of silver salmon lurking beneath the surface. Dan had been coming to this particular stretch of the Kenai for nearly 30 years. He knew every bend, every hidden pool, every submerged log that could snag a line. It was as familiar to him as the wrinkles that had gradually appeared around his eyes, testament to decades spent squinting against the glare of sun on water. His small fishing charter business, Porter's Pursuits, had given him a modest but satisfying living since he'd left his accounting job in Anchorage all those years ago. Should have brought another thermos, he muttered to himself, adjusting the straps of his tackle backpack. The September mornings were getting colder, signaling the end of the fishing season was approaching. Dan cherished these final weeks when the tourists had mostly gone home, and he could fish purely for himself, rather than guiding others to their catches. His small aluminum boat was tied up about a quarter-mile downstream, but Dan preferred to work this stretch of river on foot. The salmon were running, and he planned to bring home something for dinner. He moved slowly upstream, placing each foot carefully on the slippery river bottom. Age had taught him caution. A fall in these waters could mean more than just wet clothes. His right knee, damaged years ago when he'd slipped on his boat deck, protested with each step, but Dan ignored it. The pain was an old companion. The morning was quiet, save for the occasional call of a raven and the constant murmur of the river. Dan had always appreciated this solitude, the simplicity of man against nature. It was why he'd left Anchorage in the first place, trading spreadsheets for spreadsheets. His ex-wife, Caroline, had never understood that. She'd returned to the city 15 years ago, unable to tolerate the isolation and the uncertainty of income that came with the seasonal business. Their daughter, Melissa, now 35 and working as a nurse in Seattle, sometimes urged him to move closer to civilization as he aged, but Dan couldn't imagine living anywhere but here. He paused, at a promising eddy watching the water swirl. With practiced precision, he cast his line, the fly landing exactly where he intended. The red and silver lure danced in the current, mimicking a wounded fish. Dan felt the familiar surge of anticipation as he slowly retrieved the line. The strike came suddenly, a sharp tug that sent a jolt of excitement up his arm. Dan set the hook with a swift upward motion of his rod. The fish fought hard, darting downstream, but Dan played it skillfully, giving line when necessary and reeling in when the fish tired. After several minutes of this dance, he guided a gleaming, silver salmon toward the shore. It was a good-sized one, maybe 15 pounds. Dan smiled with satisfaction as he netted the fish, quickly dispatching it with a sharp blow to the head, a mercy that ensured the meat would be at its best. He slipped the salmon into his creel, feeling its substantial weight against his hip. One more would make for good eating, and some to share with his neighbor, George, an elderly Dena'ina man who had taught Dan more about fishing these waters than he'd ever learned from books or other anglers. The sun was higher now, burning off. The morning mist. Dan checked his watch, just past 8. He had plenty of time before he needed to head back. He decided to try a spot about 50 yards upstream where the river narrowed slightly, creating faster water that the salmon had to power through. It was a good place to intercept tired fish. As he made his way along the bank, Dan noticed signs of bear activity, partly eaten salmon carcasses and tracks in the mud. Bears were common along the Kenai, drawn by the same salmon runs that attracted fishermen. Dan carried bear spray in a holster on his hip and made a habit of singing or talking to himself as he moved through the brush, letting any nearby bears know he was there. Most preferred to avoid human encounters if given the chance. "Just me passing through," he called out in a conversational tone. "Don't mind the old man with the fishing rod." The spot Dan was heading for required a brief detour through a stand of alders. The narrow game trail was well used, probably by both wildlife and the occasional fisherman. Dan ducked under a low-hanging branch, his eyes adjusting to the dappled shade. The ground was soft here, covered with fallen leaves that muffled his footsteps. That's when he smelled it, the distinctive musky odor of bear, stronger than the usual ambient scent of the woods. Dan stopped, suddenly alert. His hand moved instinctively to the bear spray on his hip. He peered through the brush, listening intently. Nothing but the distant sound of the river and the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. Dan considered turning back, but decided to proceed with extra caution. The bear was likely aware of his presence and would probably move away. He'd had dozens of such encounters over the years, and they'd all ended with the bear choosing to avoid confrontation. "Hey, bear!" he called out more loudly. "Just passing. Through." He continued forward, making more noise than necessary, his eyes scanning the undergrowth. The trail took a sharp turn around a large spruce, and Dan followed it, still calling out periodically. As he rounded the tree, his foot caught on something solid yet yielding. Before he could catch himself, Dan was falling forward, his fishing rod clattering against stones as he thrust his hands out to break his fall. He landed hard on his stomach, the wind knocked out of him. For a moment, he lay there, dazed and trying to regain his breath. Then he heard it, a deep rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath him. Dan's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he raised his head. Not 10 feet away stood a massive grizzly bear, its dark eyes fixed on Dan with unmistakable aggression. The animal was enormous, probably over 800 pounds, with a distinctive hump between its shoulders and claws that could disembowel a man with a single swipe. But what Dan noticed most was what lay at his feet, a pile of partially eaten salmon covered with leaves and dirt in a crude cache. He had literally tripped over the bear's food stash. Time seemed to slow. Dan could hear his heart pounding in his ears. He knew not to run. Running would trigger the bear's predatory instinct. He should play dead if attacked, protect his vital areas. But in this moment, all the bear safety advice he'd accumulated over decades seemed distant and abstract. The grizzly's growl deepened, and it took a step toward him. Dan remained frozen, afraid that any movement might provoke an attack. His bear spray was on his hip, but reaching for it now seemed impossible without triggering the bear's aggressive response. "Easy," Dan whispered, though he knew the bear wouldn't understand. It was more to calm himself. "Easy now." The bear rose to its hind legs, towering over Dan at a height that must have exceeded 8 feet. It was a terrifying display of power, a reminder of how small and vulnerable humans really were in the face of such primal force. Dan closed his eyes briefly, thinking of Melissa. Would she get the call about her father, the foolish old fisherman who'd finally pushed his luck too far? Would she tell his grandchildren stories about him, or would he become a cautionary tale about the dangers of the Alaskan wilderness? The bear dropped back to all fours with a heavy thud that Dan felt through the ground. It huffed loudly, pawing at the earth. Dan remained motionless, scarcely breathing. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for such a large animal, the bear charged. Dan barely had time to curl into a protective ball, covering his neck with his hands before the impact came. The force of it drove him sideways into the base of a tree. Pain exploded through his left side as the bear's claws raked across his back. The thickness of his wading jacket and the layers beneath offered some protection, but he felt the burning sting as skin tore. The grizzly roared, the sound deafening at such close range. Dan kept his face pressed to the ground, fighting against every instinct that screamed at him to run. He felt the bear's hot breath on his neck, smelled its wild, musky odor. Then came another blow, this one to his leg. Even through the thick neoprene of his waders, Dan felt his ankle snap under the pressure of the bear's massive paw. Pain shot up his leg, and he couldn't suppress a cry of agony. The sound seemed to further agitate the bear. It bit down on Dan's backpack, teeth puncturing the fabric and narrowly missing his shoulder. With a powerful jerk of its head, the bear ripped the pack free, sending its contents scattering across the forest floor. Dan's thermos bounced against a rock with a metallic clang that momentarily startled the animal. For a fraction of a second, the bear's attention was diverted. Dan seized the opportunity, his hand darting to the bear spray holstered at his hip. His fingers closed around the canister, pulling it free. The bear turned back toward him, jaws open and ready to deliver a potentially fatal bite. Dan aimed the spray directly at the bear's face and pressed down hard on the trigger. A cloud of orange capsaicin mist erupted from the canister, enveloping the grizzly's head. The effect was immediate. The bear reared back with a roar that sounded almost like a scream, paws swiping at its eyes and nose. Dan didn't wait to see what would happen next. Despite the excruciating pain in his ankle, he rolled away from the bear and began to drag himself toward the river. using his arms to pull his body across the forest floor. Each movement sent waves of agony through his injured leg, but fear provided a powerful anesthetic. Behind him, he could hear the bear thrashing about, still dealing with the effects of the spray. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, Dan reached the edge of the tree line. The river lay about 20 yards away down a gentle slope. His boat was nowhere in sight. He'd drifted too far upstream during his fishing. He glanced back. The bear had stopped thrashing and was now staring in his direction, eyes red and watering from the spray. For a moment their gazes locked. Dan saw no mercy there, no understanding, only wild rage and pain. The grizzly took a step toward him, then another. Dan resumed his desperate crawl toward the water. If he could reach the river, maybe the current would carry him downstream to his boat. It was a slim chance, but his only one. His broken ankle dragged uselessly behind him, occasionally catching on exposed roots and sending fresh waves of pain through his body. He was halfway to the water when he heard the bear's huffing breath behind him. Dan closed his eyes, certain that this was the end. But instead of the crushing weight of the grizzly, he heard a splash from the direction of the river. Opening his eyes, he saw a flash of movement, another fisherman in the water, frantically waving his arms. "Hey! Hey, bear!" the man shouted, his voice high with fear but determined. The grizzly hesitated, caught between its injured victim and this new potential threat. The fisherman in the river continued to shout and splash, creating as much commotion as possible. He was risking his own life to divert the bear's attention. It worked. The bear turned toward the noise, giving Dan precious seconds to continue his crawl toward the water. The pain in his ankle had become a constant burning presence, and he could feel blood soaking through his jacket from the claw wounds on his back. The fisherman in the river, Dan could now see it was a young man, maybe in his 30s, had backed into deeper water, still making noise but putting more distance between himself and the shore. The bear paced along the bank, torn between pursuing Dan and investigating this noisy intruder. Dan finally reached the water's edge, pulling himself into the shallows. The cold was shocking, but he barely registered it through the haze of pain and adrenaline. He began to sidestroke with one arm, keeping his injured leg as still as possible while letting the current help carry him downstream. Behind him, he heard the young fisherman shout again, then the splash of someone moving quickly through water. Dan hoped the man was retreating to safety rather than coming to his aid. There was nothing he could do against an enraged grizzly. As the current gripped him more firmly, Dan looked back one last time. The bear stood at the water's edge, watching him float away. There was something almost contemplative in its posture, as if it were deciding whether Dan was worth the trouble of a swim. Then, with a final huff that seemed almost dismissive, the grizzly turned and ambled back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as suddenly as it had appeared. Relief flooded through Dan, temporarily overshadowing the pain. He continued to float downstream, using his good leg and one arm to guide himself toward the bank, when he spotted his aluminum boat tied to a fallen tree. It took the last of his strength to drag himself into the shallow water near the boat and pull himself aboard using the mooring rope. Once in the boat, Dan collapsed on the metal floor, shivering from cold, shock, and pain. His ankle was already swelling massively inside his wader boot, and he could feel the warm stickiness of blood on his back. He needed help, but his cell phone had been in his backpack, now probably scattered across the forest floor or being pawed at by the bear. His only option was to start the boat's motor and head downriver to the nearest access point, where there might be other fishermen or his truck parked at the launch site. With trembling hands, Dan reached for the starter cord of the outboard motor. It took 3 painful pulls before the engine sputtered to life. He untied the mooring rope, letting it fall into the water, and guided the boat into the current. The journey downriver was a blur of pain and determined focus. Dan steered mechanically, running on instinct and decades of experience on this water. Every wave that slapped against the hull sent jolts of agony through his broken ankle. The wound on his back burned like fire, and he suspected he was losing more blood than was safe. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the river widened, and Dan spotted the concrete boat ramp where he'd launched that morning. To his immense relief, there were people there, a pair of fishermen loading their gear into a pickup truck. Dan guided his boat toward the ramp, cutting the engine as he drifted the final distance. "Help!" he called, his voice weaker than he'd expected. "Bear attack! Need help!" The fishermen looked up, confused at first, then alarmed as they took in Dan's bloodied appearance. They splashed into the shallows, reaching the boat and steadying it against the current. "Jesus Christ," one of them, a bearded man in his 40s, exclaimed as he got a closer look at Dan. "Jerry, call 911, this guy's torn up bad." The second man pulled out a cell phone, stepping back toward shore to make the call while his companion helped Dan from the boat. "Grizzly," Dan managed to say, as the bearded man helped him limp toward shore, taking most of his weight. "Up by Miller's Bend, salmon cache, broke my ankle, clawed my back." "Save your strength, buddy," the man said, easing Dan down onto the tailgate of their pickup. "Help's coming. I'm Mark, by the way. That's Jerry calling the ambulance." Dan nodded weakly, the adrenaline that had kept him going now ebbing away, leaving him shaky and nauseous. "Dan Porter," he responded automatically. "Thanks for the help." Mark was examining Dan's injuries with a grim expression. "Looks like your waders took the worst of it on your legs, but your back's pretty torn up. Got a first aid kit in the truck. Gonna try to slow that bleeding until the ambulance gets here." Dan nodded again, not trusting himself to speak as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He closed his eyes briefly, seeing again the massive silhouette of the grizzly rising on its hind legs, a primal force of nature that had nearly ended his life. Mark returned with a first aid kit and began applying pressure bandages to the worst of the lacerations on Dan's back, careful not to remove the tattered remains of his jacket, which might be helping to slow the bleeding. Jerry joined them, reporting that an ambulance was on the way but would take about 20 minutes to reach their remote location. "They said to keep him warm, watch for shock," Jerry said, retrieving a blanket from their truck and draping it around Dan's shoulders. Dan was indeed starting to shake, partly from the cold of his soaked clothing but mostly from shock. The pain in his ankle had settled into a deep throbbing ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He found himself unexpectedly thinking of Caroline and wondering if she would be notified if things went bad. They hadn't spoken in over a year. "Any family we should call?" Mark asked, seeming to read Dan's thoughts. "Daughter," Dan managed. "Melissa, in Seattle." He tried to recall her number, but his mind felt foggy. "Number's in my phone, was in my pack. Bear got it." Mark nodded understandingly. "We'll figure it out later. Ambulance'll be here soon." The next 20 minutes passed in a haze for Dan. Mark and Jerry kept him talking, partly to keep him conscious, and partly, he suspected, to distract him from the pain. They were commercial fishermen from Homer, up for a day of recreation on the river. They asked about his boat, his fishing spot, anything to keep the conversation going. Dan answered mechanically, grateful for their efforts, but increasingly detached from the situation as shock took a firmer hold. When the ambulance finally arrived, its lights flashing incongruously among the trees, Dan felt a surge of relief. 2 paramedics quickly assessed his condition, their movements efficient and practiced. BPs, 90/60 and dropping, one reported to the other as they transferred Dan to a stretcher. Multiple lacerations to the back, probable broken ankle, early signs of shock. Let's get a line in him and move. Dan felt the pinch of an IV needle in his arm. Then the strange floating sensation as they lifted the stretcher into the ambulance. One of the paramedics climbed in beside him while the other closed the doors. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Porter," the paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes above her mask, assured him. "We're taking you to Central Peninsula Hospital in Soldotna. It's about a 40-minute drive. Just try to relax." Dan nodded, then remembered something important. "The bear," he said urgently. "Need to report it. Cache of salmon near Miller's Bend. Might still be aggressive." "We'll make sure Fish and Wildlife is notified," the paramedic promised, adjusting the flow of his IV. "But right now, we need to focus on you." The ambulance began to move, siren wailing as it navigated the narrow access road. Dan closed his eyes, feeling suddenly exhausted. The rhythmic swaying of the vehicle and the steady beeping of a monitor beside him created an almost hypnotic effect. Despite the pain, despite the trauma of the attack, he found himself drifting toward unconsciousness. His last coherent thought was of the bear, not with fear or anger, but with a strange sense of respect. The grizzly had been defending its food, its territory. It was Dan who had been the intruder, however unintentional. In the end, the bear had walked away, leaving him alive when it could have easily finished him. That thought followed Dan down, into darkness, as he finally succumbed to unconsciousness. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room were painfully bright when Dan regained awareness. He blinked slowly, trying to orient himself. He was lying on his right side, presumably to keep pressure off the wounds on his back. His left leg was elevated, the ankle immobilized in some kind of temporary splint. An IV line ran into his arm, and the steady beep of a heart monitor provided a metronomic backdrop to the bustling sounds of the hospital. "Mr. Porter, can you hear me?" Dan turned his head slightly to see a doctor standing beside his bed, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Yes," Dan croaked, his throat dry. "I'm awake." "Good. I'm Dr. Ramirez. You're at Central Peninsula Hospital in Soldotna. You've been in and out for a few hours now." She checked something on the monitor beside his bed. "Do you remember what happened?" The memory of the bear's charge flashed through Dan's mind with startling clarity. "Grizzly attack. I tripped over. It's salmon cache." Dr. Ramirez nodded. "That's right. You've sustained some significant injuries, but you're stable now. The lacerations on your back required 43 stitches in total, spread across 4 separate wounds. Your left ankle is broken, a bimalleolar fracture that will require surgery to stabilize. We've given you antibiotics to prevent infection and pain medication to keep you comfortable." Dan processed this information slowly. 43 stitches. Surgery. He would be off his feet for weeks, maybe months. The realization that his fishing season was over, and possibly his ability to operate his charter business next year, began to sink in. "My daughter?" he asked, suddenly remembering that Melissa would need to be notified. "We found your identification in your wallet. There was an emergency contact card with your daughter's information. She's been notified and is flying up from Seattle. She should be here by tonight." Relief washed over Dan. Despite their occasional disagreements about his lifestyle, Melissa had always been there when it counted. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "The wildlife officers are also quite interested in speaking with you when you're up to it," Dr. Ramirez added. "Apparently, there have been other reports of an aggressive bear in that area over the past week." Dan nodded slightly, not surprised. Bears that found food caches or fishing spots often returned to them repeatedly. "I'll talk to them. But the bear was just defending its food. I was the one who stumbled into its territory." Dr. Ramirez gave him an appraising look. "That's very understanding of you, considering your injuries. Most people would be calling for the bear to be tracked and put down." Dan shook his head, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "That's not necessary. It's wild country up there. We take our chances when we go in." The doctor smiled slightly. "Well, you'll have plenty of time to consider your philosophy. While you recover, the orthopedic surgeon will be in to see you shortly to discuss the procedure for your ankle. In the meantime, try to rest. The nurse can give you more pain medication if you need it." After Dr. Ramirez left, Dan lay in the sterile quiet of the emergency room, listening to the sounds of the hospital around him. A nurse came to check his vitals and adjust his IV, offering him water through a straw. The cool liquid was a blessing on his parched throat. Time passed strangely in the hospital, stretches of apparent stillness punctuated by sudden bursts of activity. An orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Chen, came to explain the surgery that would be performed the following morning. Metal plates and screws would be needed to stabilize the broken bones in his ankle. Recovery would take at least 8 to 12 weeks, with physical therapy after that. Dan listened with growing dismay, calculating the impact on his livelihood. Later, in the afternoon, 2 officers from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game arrived to take his statement about the bear attack. Dan recounted the events as clearly as he could remember them, emphasizing that he had accidentally stumbled upon the bear's food cache and that the animal had been defending its resources. "Sounds like you were lucky, Mr. Porter," one of the officers, whose name tag identified him as Ranger Wilson, commented. "Grizzlies can be territorial about their food sources, especially this time of year when they're fattening up for winter. Will you be tracking the bear?" Dan asked, hoping the answer would be no. Ranger Wilson exchanged a glance with his colleague before responding. "We'll monitor the situation. If this bear is the same one from the other reports we've received, it's been displaying unusually aggressive behavior. We might need to relocate it if it continues to pose a threat to humans in the area." Dan frowned. "It was just protecting its food. I was the intruder." "Be that as it," she added with a smile. "Your daughter just called from the airport in Anchorage. She'll be here in a couple of hours." Dan nodded gratefully, already imagining Melissa's concerned face and the inevitable lecture about the dangers of his solitary lifestyle. She'd been after him to retire and move closer to her for years. This incident would only strengthen her argument. By the time Melissa arrived, Dan had been settled into a private room on the hospital's second floor. The space was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out onto the hospital parking lot, and beyond it, the darkening Alaskan sky. "Dad." Melissa's voice broke as she entered the room, her eyes immediately taking in the IV, the monitors, and his immobilized leg. Despite his injuries, Dan felt a surge of warmth at the sight of his daughter. At 35, she looked more like Caroline than ever, the same heart-shaped face and determined set to her jaw. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the comfortable clothes of someone who'd rushed to pack for an emergency trip. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted her, trying to sound stronger than he felt. "Sorry to drag you all the way up here." Melissa approached the bed, carefully leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Don't you dare apologize. My God, Dad. When the hospital called..." She trailed off, blinking back tears. "They said you were attacked by a bear?" Dan nodded, giving her a condensed version of the encounter. Melissa listened with an expression that shifted between horror, relief, and what looked suspiciously like exasperation. "So you tripped over a bear's food pile," she summarized when he finished. "Only you, Dad." Dan managed a small smile. "Just unlucky. Or lucky, depending on how you look at it," Melissa countered. "The doctor I spoke to said if you hadn't been wearing those heavy waders, the damage to your leg could have been much worse. And if that other fisherman hadn't distracted the bear..." She didn't finish the thought. Dan nodded soberly. "I know. I owe that guy a debt I can't repay. Never even got his name." "The important thing is you're going to be okay," Melissa said, pulling a chair close to his bedside and sitting down. "But this recovery is going to be serious, Dad. The doctor says you'll need surgery tomorrow, and then weeks of healing before you can even think about putting weight on that ankle. You can't stay alone at your cabin." And there it was, the conversation Dan had been dreading. He sighed, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "I've managed on my own for a long time, Mel." Melissa made a sound that was half laugh, half snort. "Yeah, and look how that turned out. Dad, be reasonable. You can't drive with that ankle. You can't get up and down those steps at your cabin. You can't go fishing or run your charters." She paused, then added more gently, "You need help this time." Deep down, Dan knew she was right. His cabin, while beloved, was not designed for someone with limited mobility. The nearest grocery store was a 20-minute drive. If complications arose with his injuries, the hospital was even further. "What do you suggest?" he asked, already suspecting her answer. "Come back to Seattle with me," Melissa said promptly, confirming his prediction. "Just temporarily. I have that spare room, and my building has an elevator. There are good physical therapists in my neighborhood. Once you're back on your feet, you can decide what's next." Dan wanted to refuse instinctively, to insist that he could manage on his own, but the events of the day had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Not just the bear attack itself, but the stark reminder of his vulnerability. What if he'd been unable to reach his boat? What if those fishermen hadn't been at the ramp? "I'll think about it," he conceded, which was as close to agreement as he could manage at the moment. Melissa seemed to recognize this as a victory. She nodded, then shifted to practicalities, which had always been her strength. "The doctor says you'll be here for at least 3 or 4 days after the surgery. That gives us time to figure out arrangements for your boat, your cabin, your gear." Dan winced, suddenly remembering. "My gear? It's all scattered where the bear attacked me, probably ruined." "It's just stuff, Dad," Melissa said firmly. "It can be replaced." Dan didn't argue, but the loss of his custom fishing rod, a 60th birthday gift to himself, stung almost as much as his physical injuries. That rod had pulled in countless salmon over the last several months. They talked a while longer, Melissa filling him in on her life in Seattle, her job at the hospital, her recent breakup with a doctor she'd been dating, her consideration of getting a dog. Dan listened with genuine interest, grateful for the distraction from his own situation. Eventually, though, the pain medication and exhaustion began to take their toll. Melissa noticed his eyelids drooping. "You should rest," she said, standing up. "I'll find a hotel nearby and come back in the morning before your surgery." "You could stay at my cabin," Dan offered. "Keys in my truck at the boat ramp." "If it's still there," he added as an afterthought. "The Rangers brought your truck here," Melissa informed him. "It's in the hospital parking lot, but I think I'll stay closer to the hospital tonight." She squeezed his hand gently. I'll see. You first thing tomorrow. Try to get some sleep. After Melissa left, Dan found himself alone with his thoughts. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the bear encounter in his mind. Despite the trauma, despite his injuries, he couldn't bring himself to hate the animal. The grizzly had been acting according to its nature, defending what was its own. What troubled Dan more was the recognition of his own mortality that the attack had forced upon him. At 60, he was still strong and capable, or had been until today, but the grizzly had reminded him with brutal clarity of how quickly that could change. One moment of bad luck, one step in the wrong direction, and everything could be taken away. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nurses checking his vitals and administering medication, and by dreams of rushing water and the sound of heavy paws on forest floor. Dan woke early, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings, then grimly remembering as the pain in his ankle made itself known again. The day of surgery passed in a blur of medical procedures and brief conversations. Melissa was there. Before they took him to the operating room, her presence a comforting constant amid the clinical chaos. Dr. Chen explained the procedure again, mapping out on a diagram how the metal plates would stabilize the broken bones. Dan listened with detached interest, already resigned to whatever needed to be done. The anesthesia was a blessing, providing a few hours of complete oblivion. When Dan woke in the recovery room, his ankle was encased in a solid cast, the pain dulled by medication, but still present as a throbbing reminder of his encounter. Over the next 3 days, Dan's world narrowed to the confines of his hospital room. Melissa visited daily, dividing her time between his bedside and making arrangements for his eventual discharge. She had taken 2 weeks of emergency family leave from her job in Seattle, and she was determined to use that time to settle Dan's affairs in Alaska before bringing him back with her. "I spoke to George, your neighbor," she reported on the second day after surgery. "He's going to check on your cabin every few days, make sure everything's okay." Dan nodded gratefully. George was the closest thing to a friend he had in the area, a taciturn Dena'ina elder who lived about a mile down the Fee road from Dan's cabin. They rarely spoke at length, but there was a mutual respect between them, built over years of shared space and occasional assistance. "And I called that guy you rent your boat slip from," Melissa continued. "He said he'll keep an eye on your boat until you decide what you want to do with it." The mention of his boat brought a pang of longing for the river, for the simple rhythm of days spent on the water. "What about my charters?" Dan asked. "I had 2 bookings for next week." Melissa's expression turned apologetic. "I had to cancel them, Dad. There's no way you could guide anyone in your condition." Dan knew she was right, but the financial implications were troubling. Charter bookings were his main source of income, and the fall season was usually busy with fishermen seeking late-season salmon. With his ankle in a cast for at least 6 weeks, he would miss the rest of this year's runs. "Maybe next season," he said, more to reassure himself than anything else. Melissa hesitated, then placed her hand on his. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe this is a sign that it's time to consider other options." Dan tensed, knowing what was coming. "You're 60 years old," Melissa continued gently. "You live alone in a remote cabin. What if something like this happens again, but worse? What if there's no one around to help?" "I've managed fine for 30 years, Dan said stubbornly, though the argument felt hollow even to himself. "Yes, but you were younger then, and Mom was still with you for part of that time." Melissa squeezed his hand. "I'm not saying you have to move to Seattle permanently or give up fishing altogether, but maybe it's time to think about a place closer to town, with neighbors and services nearby." Dan didn't respond immediately. The truth was he had been having similar thoughts himself since the attack. Not that he would admit it to Melissa just yet. She'd always been too much like him, seizing on any concession as a victory. "We don't have to decide everything now," Melissa added, seeming to sense his resistance. "Let's just focus on getting you through the next few weeks. You'll come to Seattle, do your physical therapy, get stronger. Then we'll figure out the next steps." Dan nodded, grateful for the temporary reprieve from making decisions about his future. "That seems reasonable," he agreed, which earned him a surprised smile from his daughter. On the 4th day after the surgery, Dr. Chen came to discuss Dan's discharge plan. The operation had been successful, with the plates and screws properly securing the broken bones in his ankle. The lacerations on his back were healing well, though they would leave significant scars. You'll need to keep weight off that ankle completely for at least 4 weeks, Dr. Chen instructed. After that, we'll reassess and possibly begin partial weight-bearing with crutches or a walker. Full recovery will take several months, and you'll need physical therapy to regain full strength and mobility. Dan listened with growing dismay. Months of recovery meant months without income, months of dependence on others. The financial implications alone were daunting. His health insurance would cover most of the hospital bills, but the loss of income was another matter entirely. I understand your daughter is taking you to Seattle for your recovery, Dr. Chen continued. Dan nodded, still not entirely comfortable with the plan, but seeing few alternatives. That's right. Good. I'll provide referrals to orthopedic specialists there who can monitor your progress. Dr. Chen made some notes in Dan's chart. You're lucky, Mr. Porter. Bear attacks often result in much more severe injuries. Your quick thinking with the bear spray likely saved your life. After the doctor left, Dan sat in contemplative silence. Lucky wasn't the word he would have chosen to describe his situation, but he understood what Dr. Chen meant. He had survived an encounter that could have been fatal. Many others hadn't been so fortunate. The remainder of the day was spent making final preparations for discharge. Melissa brought clothes for him from his cabin, loose sweatpants that could fit over his cast, comfortable shirts that wouldn't irritate the healing wounds on his back. A physical therapist came to demonstrate how to use crutches, though Dan's movement was still limited by pain and the stitches on his back. That evening, as Dan was attempting to master the art of maneuvering to the bathroom with crutches, an unexpected visitor arrived, Ranger Wilson from Fish and Game. "Hope I'm not interrupting," the ranger said, standing in the doorway. "Just wanted to check on you before you leave town." Dan gestured for him to enter. "Not interrupting, come in." Wilson stepped into the room, removing his official cap. He was a tall man with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. "Heard you're heading to Seattle for recovery," he said. "Good decision, those injuries need proper care." Dan nodded non-committally. "Any news about the bear?" Wilson's expression grew more serious. "Actually, that's partly why I'm here. We've confirmed it's the same grizzly that's been causing problems in the area. Distinctive scar pattern on its right shoulder that matches descriptions from other encounters. It charged a hiking group the day after. Your attack, though no one was injured that time." Dan felt a strange mixture of emotions at this news, concern for others who might cross paths with the bear, but also a lingering sense of connection to the animal that had almost killed him. "What will happen to it?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Wilson sighed. "We're still monitoring the situation. If it continues to display aggressive behavior toward humans, we may have no choice but to put it down. Bears that lose their fear of humans or begin to associate them with food sources can become extremely dangerous." "It wasn't after me as food," Dan pointed out. "It was defending its cache." "True," Wilson acknowledged, "but that distinction won't matter much to the next person who accidentally stumbles into its territory." He paused, studying Dan with curiosity. "Most attack victims I've spoken to are ready to grab a rifle and go after the bear themselves. You seem almost sympathetic to it." Dan shifted uncomfortably, both from his physical pain and the difficulty of articulating his feelings. "I've been fishing these rivers for 30 years, he said finally. "Seen plenty of bears. They're just doing what bears do, searching for food, protecting their territory. This one could have killed me if it wanted to, but it walked away." Wilson nodded slowly. "That's often the case with defensive attacks. Once the threat is gone, in this case, once you were away from its food cache, the bear loses interest." He hesitated, then added, "Still, this one's showing a pattern of aggressive responses. We have to consider public safety." Dan understood the ranger's position, even if he didn't entirely agree with it. "I'd prefer if you didn't kill it on my account," he said quietly. "Noted," Wilson replied, though his tone suggested the decision would be based on broader considerations. "Anyway, I wanted to return this to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it out to Dan. It was Dan's pocket knife, a worn wooden-handled tool he'd carried for decades. The sight of it brought an unexpected lump to his throat. "Where did you find it?" "We went back to document the attack site," Wilson explained. "Found this and a few other personal items scattered around. Thought you might want it back." Dan took the knife, its familiar weight in his palm oddly comforting. "Thank you. Didn't expect to see this again." Wilson nodded. The rest of your gear was pretty badly damaged. Backpack was torn to shreds. But we did recover your fishing license and a few other small items. I left them with the nurse at the station. They talked a while longer about the attack, with Wilson taking a few additional notes for his official report. As the ranger prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway. One last thing, Mr. Porter. The local paper's been asking about your attack. Standard procedure is that we don't release victim names without permission. Would you be willing to speak with a reporter? Might help raise awareness about bear safety in the area. Dan's immediate instinct was to refuse. He'd never sought attention, and the idea of becoming a local news story was uncomfortable, but he also recognized the potential value in sharing his experience if it could help others avoid similar situations. Maybe, he said after a moment's consideration. Not right now, though. Need to get through this first. He gestured at his cast and the hospital room in general. Wilson nodded understandingly. Fair enough. I'll let them know you're recovering and might be available to comment later. He extended his hand. Safe travels to Seattle, Mr. Porter. Hope the recovery goes smoothly. After Wilson left, Dan sat examining his recovered pocket knife, turning it over in his hands. The worn wooden handle bore the marks of years of use, nicks, and scratches that told the story of a life spent outdoors. His father had given him this knife when he was 12, his first real tool. That it had survived the bear attack when so much else was lost seemed somehow significant. Melissa returned a short while later with dinner from a local diner, much preferred over the hospital food he'd been eating. She noticed the knife immediately. Where did that come from, she asked, setting down the paper bags of food. Ranger brought it, Dan explained. Found it at the attack site. Melissa's expression softened. Dad's knife. I remember when you used to let me whittle sticks with it when I was little. She smiled at the memory. You always said, a sharp knife is safer than a dull one, Dan finished with her, returning the smile. These small connections, shared memories, familiar objects, seemed suddenly precious in a way they hadn't before. They ate dinner together, discussing the logistics of tomorrow's departure. Melissa had booked them on an afternoon flight from Kenai to Anchorage, then a connection to Seattle. The hospital would provide a wheelchair for the airport, and arrangements had been made for similar assistance in Seattle. George says he'll check on your cabin regularly, Melissa reported between bites of her burger, and the boat's secure at the marina. I've paid the slip fee through the end of the month, so we have time to decide what to do about it. Dan nodded, though the mention of his boat brought a fresh wave of uncertainty about the future. Thanks for handling all that, he said sincerely. Don't know what I'd have done without you here. Melissa's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected gratitude. Well, she said, recovering quickly, that's kind of my point about living so remotely, Dad. Dan chuckled despite himself. Walked right into that one, didn't I? The evening passed comfortably, with Melissa sharing more stories about her life in Seattle, and Dan listening more attentively than he perhaps had in years. The bear attack had shifted something fundamental in his perspective, a reminder that the future he had always taken for granted was not guaranteed. Morning brought the bustle of discharge preparations. A nurse removed the IV from Dan's arm and provided detailed instructions for wound care and medication management. The hospital supplied a set of crutches adjusted to his height, though using them was still awkward and painful with the healing lacerations on his back. Remember, no weight on that ankle for at least 4 weeks, the nurse reminded him as she helped him into the wheelchair that would transport him to Melissa's rental car. And keep those wounds on your back clean and dry. You'll need to have the stitches removed in about 10 days. Dan nodded dutifully, already feeling overwhelmed by the list of medical instructions. Melissa, ever organized, had taken detailed notes and collected all his prescription medications from the hospital pharmacy. Leaving the hospital was both a relief and a source of anxiety. After 5 days in the controlled environment of the medical facility, the outside world seemed suddenly vast and complicated. The simple act of transferring from the wheelchair to the passenger seat of the rental car was a painful reminder of his new limitations. As Melissa drove them away from the hospital, Dan gazed out the window at the familiar landscape of the Toihanai Peninsula. The spruce forests and distant mountains had been his home for 30 years. Now he was leaving, possibly for months perhaps, though he wasn't ready to admit this yet. Permanently. We need to stop by your cabin to pick up. More of your things, Melissa said, interrupting his thoughts. I packed what I could, but you'll need clothes for Seattle, important documents, that sort of thing. Dan nodded. simultaneously eager and reluctant to see his cabin one last time before leaving. My wallet should be in the bedside drawer. Passport, too, I think. The drive to his cabin took about 40 minutes, winding through the forest on increasingly narrow roads. When they finally pulled up to the small log structure, Dan felt a tightening in his chest. The cabin wasn't large or luxurious, just a single-story building with a main room, a small bedroom, and a basic bathroom. But it had been his sanctuary for decades. Melissa helped him navigate the 3 steps to the front porch, a process that proved more difficult and painful than Dan had anticipated. Once inside, he stood leaning heavily on his crutches, taking in the familiar surroundings: the stone fireplace with its collection of fishing trophies on the mantel, the worn leather armchair where he spent evenings reading, the small dining table still bearing the remains of his breakfast from the morning of the attack. "I'll pack some more of your clothes," Melissa said, heading toward the bedroom. "You should sit down, Dad. You look pale." Dan eased himself carefully into his armchair, propping his casted leg on the footstool. From this vantage point, he could see through the front window to where his boat should have been parked on its trailer. The empty space was a stark reminder of how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. Melissa moved efficiently through the cabin, gathering clothes, toiletries, and documents. Dan directed her to various items: his reading glasses, a particular sweater he liked, the charger for his backup cell phone. As she packed, she occasionally paused to examine photographs or objects that caught her attention. "I haven't seen this in years," she said, picking up a framed photo from the bookshelf. It showed a much younger Dan and Caroline, with Melissa between them as a gap-toothed 8-year-old, all standing proudly beside Dan's first fishing boat. "Summer of '98, Dan recalled. "Your first big salmon." The memory was bittersweet, a happy moment from when they had still been a family. Melissa set the photo down and continued packing. Dan watched her, struck by how capable his daughter had become, how different her life was from his. Her world was one of hospitals and schedules, city apartments and coffee shops. Yet here she was, efficiently dismantling parts of his life to transport them to her world, at least temporarily. "I think that's everything essential," Melissa announced finally, zipping closed a large duffel bag. "Is there anything else you absolutely need?" Dan looked around the cabin, trying to think of what material possessions might matter during his convalescence in Seattle. His gaze fell on the fishing rod rack near the door, mostly empty now, with his best rod lost during the bear attack. One remained, though, an older model he kept as a backup. "That rod," he said, pointing. "Might as well bring it. Never know when I might get a chance to use it." Melissa raised an eyebrow, but retrieved the rod without comment, breaking it down into its carrying case. Dan suspected she thought it wishful thinking that he'd be fishing anytime soon, but the rod represented something important, a connection to his normal life, a promise of eventual return to activities he loved. As they prepared to leave, Dan took one last look around the cabin, trying to commit every detail to memory. "George has a spare key?" he asked. Melissa nodded. "Yes, and I left him my cell number in case anything needs attention while you're gone." Dan hesitated at the door, unexpected emotion welling up. 30 years in this place," he said quietly. "Longest I've ever been away is 2 weeks. Melissa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It'll be here when you're ready to come back," she said, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't convinced that would happen. The journey from the Kenai Peninsula to Seattle was long and uncomfortable. Dan's injuries made sitting for extended periods painful, and navigating through airports in a wheelchair was a new and humbling experience. By the time they arrived at Melissa's apartment building in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, he was exhausted and in considerable pain, his medication having worn off during the final leg of their journey. Melissa's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modern building, but thankfully accessible by elevator as she had promised. The space was much smaller than his cabin, a compact one-bedroom with a pull-out sofa in the living room that would serve as Dan's bed during his stay. "It's not much," Melissa apologized as she helped him inside. "But the bathroom's right there and the kitchen's open to the living room, so everything's easy to reach." Dan nodded tiredly, too drained to offer much response. The urban environment was already disorienting, the constant background noise of traffic, the proximity of neighbors, the lack of natural surroundings visible from the windows. Instead of his view of spruce forest and distant mountains, Melissa's apartment looked out onto other buildings and a busy street below. The next several days passed in a blur of adjustment and medical appointments. Melissa had arranged for a local orthopedic specialist to take over Dan's care, and the first follow-up appointment confirmed that his ankle was healing as expected. The stitches in his back were removed, leaving behind angry red scars that would eventually fade to white, but never disappear completely, permanent reminders of his encounter with the grizzly. Physical limitations aside, the most difficult adjustment for Dan was the abrupt change in environment. After decades of relative solitude in the Alaskan wilderness, the constant stimulation of urban life was overwhelming. Simple tasks became complicated endeavors, showering while keeping his cast dry, navigating the small apartment on crutches, even sleeping on the unfamiliar pull-out sofa. Melissa was patient and supportive, but Dan could sense her growing concern about his subdued mood. She tried to engage him in activities, watching nature documentaries on her television, introducing him to neighbors in the building, bringing home books about fishing from the local library. Dan appreciated her efforts, but found himself increasingly withdrawn, his thoughts constantly returning to his cabin, his boat, the river. A week into his stay in Seattle, Dan was sitting by the apartment window, gazing out at the rainy cityscape. When Melissa arrived home from her shift at the hospital, she hung up her wet raincoat and approached him with an expression that suggested she had news. "I got a call from Ranger Wilson today," she said, sitting in the chair opposite him. "He thought you'd want to know they've been monitoring the bear that attacked you." Dan looked up with interest. "And? It's moved deeper into the park, away from the popular fishing spots. They've been tracking it with trail cameras. So far, no further aggressive encounters with humans." Melissa hesitated, then added, "They've decided not to euthanize it, at least for now." A weight Dan hadn't realized he was carrying seemed to lift slightly. "Good," he said simply. "Bear was just being a bear." Melissa studied him for a moment. "You know, most people wouldn't be so understanding about an animal that nearly killed them." Dan shrugged, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing scars. "Wasn't personal. I invaded its space, not the other way around." He turned back to the window. "Ranger say anything else?" "Actually, yes. There was a small article about your attack in the local paper up there. Nothing detailed, just a brief mention of an incident involving a fisherman and a grizzly. But apparently the fisherman who helped distract the bear saw it and contacted the ranger station. He was asking if you were okay." Dan turned back to her, surprised. "Did they get his name?" Melissa nodded. "Michael Tanner. He's a school teacher. From Anchorage, was on a weekend fishing trip. Ranger Wilson gave him my number with my permission. He might call to check on you." The news that his unknown savior had a name, was a real person with a life and a job, brought the events of the attack into sharper focus for Dan. Without that teacher's brave intervention, the outcome might have been very different. "Would like to thank him," Dan said. "Man risked his life." "Well, you might get the chance," Melissa replied. "He seemed quite concerned about you." The possibility of connecting with someone who had shared in that pivotal moment was oddly comforting to Dan. It was a reminder that his experience, while deeply personal, wasn't entirely isolated. Someone else had witnessed it, had been part of it. That evening, as Melissa prepared dinner, Dan's phone rang with an unfamiliar Anchorage number. With a sense of anticipation, he answered. "Hello, is this Dan Porter?" a male voice asked. "It is," Dan confirmed. "Mr. Porter, this is Michael Tanner. I'm not sure if your daughter mentioned it, but I was the fisherman who was there when you had your encounter with the grizzly last month. I've been wondering how you're doing." Dan felt a surge of emotion at the sound of the voice that had shouted to distract the bear. "She told me. Been wanting to thank you. What you did—" He paused, searching for adequate words. "Not many would have done that." "I'm just glad I was there," Michael replied. "When I saw that bear charging toward you, I acted on instinct more than anything. Wasn't until afterward that I realized how dangerous it was." "Saved my life," Dan said simply. "Bear would have finished me if it hadn't been distracted." There was a brief silence on the line. "How are your injuries?" Michael asked finally. Dan gave him a summary of his broken ankle, the lacerations, his current recovery in Seattle. Michael listened, occasionally asking questions that suggested he had some medical knowledge. "My wife's a nurse," he explained, when Dan commented on this. "You pick things up. Sounds like you've got a long recovery." "To head, but you're lucky the injuries weren't worse." "That's what they keep telling me," Dan said dryly. Lucky isn't exactly how it feels, but I take the point. Michael chuckled. I can imagine. Listen, I don't want to intrude, but if there's anything I can do from up here, check on your property, help with anything, just let me know. I live in Anchorage, but I get down to the Kenai pretty regularly for fishing. The offer was unexpected and touching. Appreciate that, Dan said sincerely. Neighbors keeping an eye on my cabin for now, but thanks. They talked a while longer, discovering a shared passion for salmon fishing and exchanging stories of favorite spots on the Kenai. By the time they ended the call, Dan felt a connection to this stranger who had become an important part of his life story. That was nice of him to call, Melissa commented when Dan told her about the conversation. Fight sir. Not everyone would follow up like that. Dan nodded thoughtfully. Decent guy, teaches high school biology in Anchorage, said he'd check on my cabin sometimes when he's fishing in the area. Melissa raised her eyebrows. And you're okay with that? You're usually pretty private about your space. Dan considered this. Seems like the kind of person you can trust, he said finally. And he did save my life. The call from Michael marked a subtle turning point in Dan's outlook. The connection to someone who understood Alaska, who shared his passion for fishing, who had been part of his traumatic experience. It provided a bridge between his former life and his current situation. In the days that followed, Dan found himself slightly more engaged with his surroundings, more willing to participate in the routines of Seattle life. Physical therapy began in earnest, painful sessions that left Dan exhausted but provided tangible evidence of progress. His therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Elena, pushed him hard but respected his determination. Within 3 weeks, he had graduated from complete non-weight-bearing to being allowed to place minimal weight on his injured ankle while using a walker. You're healing well for someone your age, Elena commented during a particularly challenging session. Most 60-year-olds with this type of fracture take longer to progress. Lot of walking in my normal life, Dan explained between controlled breaths as he worked through an exercise. Miles every day on the river, on uneven ground, builds strength. Eleanor nodded approvingly. That foundation is serving you well now. If you keep this up, you might be back to fishing sooner than expected. The mention of fishing brought both hope and uncertainty. Dan had been avoiding thoughts about the long-term future, focusing instead on the immediate challenges of recovery. But as his body began to heal, questions about what came next became harder to ignore. Those questions took on new urgency one evening when Melissa raised the subject of his boat. They were eating dinner, takeout from a nearby Thai restaurant that Dan had to admit was better than anything available near his cabin. I got a call from the marina where your boat is stored, Melissa said, setting down her fork. The monthly fee is due again and they were wondering about your plans. Are you thinking of selling it? The question caught Dan off guard, though it shouldn't have. The boat was a significant expense to maintain if it wasn't being used, and his financial situation was already precarious with the loss of income from cancelled charters. Haven't decided, he said after a pause. Melissa nodded, choosing her words carefully. It's just that, well, with your recovery likely to take several more months and the fishing season pretty much over now anyway, it might make financial sense to sell it and then reassess next year. Dan understood the logic, but felt a visceral resistance to the suggestion. His boat represented more than just a possession. It was his livelihood, his connection to the life he had built. Selling it would be a tacit admission that he might not return to that life. Need to think about it, he said, not meeting Melissa's eyes. She didn't press the issue, but the question lingered between them, unresolved. That night, lying on the pull-out sofa and listening to the unfamiliar urban sounds outside, Dan found himself wrestling with possibilities he had been avoiding. What if his ankle didn't heal well enough for him to navigate the challenging terrain of river fishing? What if the financial impact of this extended recovery forced him to make changes he'd been resisting? What if, as Melissa had been suggesting for years, it was simply time to acknowledge that living alone in a remote cabin at his age carried risks that had now been dramatically demonstrated? The next morning, after Melissa left for her shift at the hospital, Dan made a decision. Using his phone, he called George, his neighbor in Alaska. Dan, good to hear from you. George's gravelly voice came through the line. How's the recovery going? Slow but steady, Dan replied. Listen, George, need a favor. Could you take some pictures of my boat? Engine, hull, interior, everything. Want to see what condition it's in? There was a brief pause. Thinking of selling it? George asked perceptively. Maybe, Dan admitted. Need to consider options. I can do that, George said without judgment. Supposed to check on your cabin tomorrow anyway. I'll swing by the marina, take those pictures. Appreciate it. Dan hesitated, then added, while you're at it, maybe take a few of the cabin too, inside and out. Sure thing, George agreed, though Dan could hear the unspoken question in his tone. I'll send them to your phone. After ending the call, Dan sat for a long time looking out the apartment window at the Seattle skyline. The decision to potentially sell his boat wasn't made yet, but simply considering it felt like a significant step, an acknowledgement that his life might be entering a new phase. 2 days later, the pictures arrived from George. Dan scrolled through them slowly, his aluminum boat looking smaller than he remembered in the storage yard, the familiar interior with its worn seats and practical storage compartments, the cabin with its weathered logs and sturdy porch. Everything appeared well-maintained but somehow more fragile than it had in his memory, as if the distance and his injuries had altered his perception. When Melissa came home that evening, Dan was still looking at the photos. He handed her the phone without comment, letting her scroll through them. Everything looks good, she said encouragingly. George is taking good care of the place. Dan nodded, then took a deep breath. Been thinking about the boat, he said. Might be time to sell it. Melissa's surprise was evident, but she controlled her reaction. Are you sure that's a big decision? Not getting any younger, Dan said with a shrug that was meant to appear casual but didn't quite succeed. And this, he gestured at his casted ankle, changes things. Might be time to consider alternatives. Melissa set the phone down and regarded her father with a mixture of concern and hope. What kind of alternatives? Dan had been pondering this question for days, weighing options that would have seemed unthinkable before the bear attack. Not sure yet, he admitted, but probably not the remote cabin, maybe something closer to town, place where I could still fish but have people nearby, just in case. The admission cost him something in pride, but Dan found that saying it aloud was also strangely liberating. The bear encounter had forced him to confront his vulnerability in ways he'd been avoiding for years. Melissa reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I think that's wise, Dad. And it doesn't mean giving up what you love. No, Dan agreed, just doing it differently. The decision to sell the boat set other changes in motion. Over the following weeks, as Dan continued his physical therapy and gradually increased his mobility, he and Melissa had more concrete discussions about his future. She helped him research housing options in Alaska, places closer to Soldotna or even Anchorage that would provide both independence and proximity to services he might need as he aged. Michael Tanner, the teacher who had helped during the bear attack, became an unexpected ally in this transition. He called every couple of weeks to check on Dan's progress and eventually volunteered to help with the boat sale. I know a few people looking for reliable fishing boats, he offered, and I can show it to potential buyers since I'm up there. Dan accepted the help gratefully. Michael proved to be both knowledgeable and trustworthy, screening potential buyers and providing honest assessments of their offers. By mid-November, just over 6 weeks after the attack, the boat was sold to a young commercial fisherman for a fair price. Rather than feeling bereaved at the loss, Dan found himself experiencing a sense of possibility. The money from the sale provided a financial cushion that eased his immediate concerns and opened up options for where he might live next. As November turned to December, Dan's recovery continued to progress. His cast was replaced with a walking boot, allowing more mobility and independence. He could now navigate Melissa's apartment without crutches, though he still used them for longer excursions outside. The scars on his back had faded from angry red to pink, though they remained sensitive to pressure. With the increased mobility came a growing restlessness. Seattle was not without its charms. Dan had developed an appreciation for the coffee shops within walking distance of Melissa's apartment and had even reluctantly enjoyed a visit to the Seattle Aquarium's salmon exhibit. But the constant noise, the crowds, the absence of true wilderness, these wore on him daily. I'm thinking it's about time I headed back to Alaska, he told Melissa one evening in early December. Not to the cabin necessarily, but back home. She studied him with the professional assessment of a nurse combined with the personal concern of a daughter. Your ankle still needs at least another month of healing before you're fully weight-bearing, she pointed out, and you'll need ongoing physical therapy. They have doctors in Alaska, Dan said mildly, and physical therapists. Melissa sighed, recognizing the familiar stubborn set to her father's jaw. At least wait until after the holidays, she suggested. It's only a few more weeks, and I've already asked for Christmas off so we could spend it together. The appeal worked. Dan nodded in agreement, though the concession came with a caveat. After New Year's, though, I'm heading back. Need to figure out the next chapter. Christmas with Melissa proved to be more enjoyable than Dan had anticipated. She decorated her small apartment with a miniature tree and strung lights around the windows, creating a cozy atmosphere that reminded Dan of holidays when she was a child. They exchanged modest gifts, new wool socks and a field guide to Pacific. Salmon for Dan, a handcrafted bird feeder Dan had made during his hours alone in the apartment, and a vintage fishing lure he'd found in a Seattle antique shop for Melissa. The holiday also brought an unexpected phone call. Michael Tanner invited Dan to stay at his house in Anchorage when he returned to Alaska, at least temporarily, while he figured out his next steps. "We've got a guest room that's just sitting empty," Michael explained. "My wife Beth is on board with the idea. Might be a good transition before you decide on a permanent place." The offer was tempting. Anchorage wasn't Dan's first choice of location, too urban for his tastes, but it would put him back in Alaska and the arrangement would be temporary. After discussing it with Melissa, who supported the idea of him having someone nearby during the final stages of his recovery, Dan accepted. "Just until I find my own place," he emphasized to both Michael and Melissa. "Don't want to impose." January brought Dan's return to Alaska. Melissa accompanied him, having arranged a week off work to help him settle. The flight from Seattle to Anchorage felt like a homecoming, despite Dan's uncertainty about the future. As the plane descended through clouds to reveal the snow-covered landscape below, he felt something inside him relax. Michael and his wife Beth met them at the airport, a welcome committee that left Dan feeling both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. Beth, a petite woman with kind eyes and efficient movements that spoke to her nursing background, immediately assessed Dan's physical condition with a professional glance. "You're putting too much weight on that ankle," she observed as they walked to the parking area. "We'll need to adjust your therapy routine." Dan found himself smiling at her direct approach, so similar to Melissa's. "Yes, ma'am," he responded with mock solemnity, which earned him a grin from Michael and an eye roll from both women. The Tanners' home was a spacious two-story house in a quiet neighborhood on Anchorage's east side. To Dan's relief, the guest room was on the first floor, eliminating the need to navigate stairs with his still healing ankle. The room was simple but comfortable, with a window that looked out onto a snow-covered backyard bordered by spruce trees, a small reminder of the wilderness he missed. Over the next several days, a routine developed. Beth, who worked at the same hospital where Dan's new orthopedic specialist practiced, drove him to medical appointments. Michael, on winter break from his teaching position, took Dan on short excursions around Anchorage, gradually introducing him to the city that might become his new home base. "There's a good fishing community here," Michael pointed out as they drove past a specialty outdoor store that catered to anglers. "And you're only a couple hours from some world-class salmon rivers." Dan nodded, appreciating the effort Michael was making to highlight connections to his former life. "Different from having the river right outside your door," he said, "but there are advantages too." One of those advantages became apparent when Melissa prepared to return to Seattle. Unlike his remote cabin, where her departure would have left him truly isolated, in Anchorage, Dan had resources: Michael and Beth, medical facilities, transportation, options, even grocery delivery services if needed. "I feel better about leaving you here," Melissa admitted as he drove her to the airport. She had insisted on taking a taxi, but Dan, now driving again with his walking boot, had insisted more strongly on seeing her off personally. "There are people around if you need help." "Feels strange," Dan confessed, "having people check on me, arrange things, been independent a long time." Melissa smiled. "Independence doesn't have to mean isolation, Dad. Even trees in the forest depend on each other, right? Isn't that something you used to tell me?" Dan chuckled at having his own wisdom turned back on him. "Using my lines against me now?" After Melissa's departure, Dan focused on two priorities: continuing his physical recovery and figuring out where to live next. The first progressed steadily. By early February, he was walking with only a slight limp, the walking boot replaced by a supportive brace that fit inside his regular snow boot. The scars on his back had faded further, though they still occasionally ached. especially in the cold Alaska winter. The second priority proved more challenging. Dan spent hours researching housing options, considering everything from apartments in Anchorage to small houses in Soldotna. Nothing felt quite right. The apartments were too cramped, too urban. The houses required more maintenance than he felt capable of managing with his lingering physical limitations. "It's like Goldilocks," he complained to Michael one evening as they sat in the Tanner's living room, maps and real estate listings spread out before them. "Everything's either too big or too small, too remote or too crowded." Michael nodded sympathetically. "Finding the right balance isn't easy, but there's no rush, Dan. You're welcome here until you figure it out." The solution came from an unexpected source. Beth, who had been listening to their conversation while grading papers at the dining table, looked up with a thoughtful expression. "What about Eagle River?" she suggested. "It's close enough to Anchorage for medical care and services, but it's more rural. Lots of outdoor people live there." Dan considered this. Eagle River was a community about 15 miles northeast of Anchorage, not quite a separate town, but not part of the urban sprawl either. It had the advantage of proximity to both city services and natural areas. "Might be worth looking at," he acknowledged. The next day, Michael drove Dan to Eagle River to explore. As they passed through the small downtown area and into residential neighborhoods nestled among trees, Dan felt a growing sense of possibility. The houses here were set farther apart than in Anchorage proper, many with views of the surrounding mountains. There was space to breathe. They stopped at a real estate office on impulse, and to Dan's surprise, the agent mentioned a property that immediately caught his interest, a small, one-bedroom cabin on a half-acre lot at the edge of the community. It had originally been a recreational property, but had been winterized by the previous owner. "It's been on the market for a while," the agent explained as she drove them to see it. "Most buyers want something bigger, more modern, but for a single person who doesn't need much space." The cabin was nothing like Dan's place on the Kenai, smaller, with modern amenities like reliable electricity and plumbing, and neighbors within shouting distance rather than miles away. But as he limped around the property, taking in the sturdy construction, the wood stove in the corner, the small deck that looked out onto a stand of birch trees, he felt a sense of recognition. This could work. The price was within range of what he could afford, especially with the proceeds from his boat sale. The property taxes were reasonable, and most importantly, while the cabin offered privacy and a connection to nature, it was only minutes from medical facilities, grocery stores, and other services that he now recognized were increasingly important as he aged. "What do you think?" Michael asked as they prepared to leave. Dan looked back at the cabin, trying to picture himself living there, not the life he had known for 30 years, but a new chapter that acknowledged both his love of independence and the realities of his situation. "Think I just found my next home," he said simply. The process of purchasing the Eagle River cabin moved surprisingly quickly. The seller, an elderly woman who had moved to Arizona for health reasons, was eager to close the deal. By the end of February, Dan had signed the papers and received the keys to his new home. Moving in was a more gradual process. His belongings from the Kenai cabin needed to be sorted, packed, and transported, a task complicated by his continuing mobility limitations and the winter weather. George proved invaluable once again, organizing the packing and hiring a local mover to transport everything to Eagle River. Throughout this transition, Dan maintained periodic contact with Ranger Wilson, who provided updates on the bear that had attacked him. The grizzly had denned for the winter in a remote area of the park, and wildlife officials had decided to continue monitoring it rather than taking more drastic measures. "So far, it's showing normal behavior patterns," Wilson reported during a phone call in early March. "Spring will be the real test when it emerges from hibernation and humans are back in its territory." Dan found himself oddly invested in the bear's fate. "Let me know how it goes," he requested. "Prefer to think of it out there living its bear life rather than shot because of our encounter." By mid-March, Dan was fully settled in his Eagle River cabin. The space was arranged to accommodate his needs, a comfortable recliner positioned to look out the front window, fishing books and equipment organized on easily accessible shelves, a new bed that was kinder to his still occasionally aching back than his old one had been. The physical reminders of his bear encounter were fading, but would never disappear completely. His ankle, while functional, sometimes throbbed before weather changes. The scars on his back had lightened to silvery marks that pulled slightly when he reached for objects on high shelves, but these limitations had become familiar, integrated into his daily existence rather than obstacles to it. More significant were the psychological changes the attack had precipitated. Dan found himself more aware of his surroundings, more attuned to potential dangers. He was more willing to accept help when offered, less insistent on complete self-sufficiency. And he had developed a deeper appreciation for human connections, his daughter's persistent care, Michael and Beth's generous friendship, even the professional attention of the medical team that had helped him recover. As April arrived, bringing the first signs of spring to south-central Alaska, Dan began to plan his return to fishing. His new location offered access to different rivers and streams than he had frequented before, requiring research and exploration. Michael, who had become a regular visitor to the Eagle River cabin, offered to accompany him on these expeditions. First salmon run should be starting soon, Michael noted one Saturday as they sat on Dan's small deck, enjoying the strengthening spring sunshine. Feel up to testing that ankle on some riverbanks? Dan nodded, feeling a familiar anticipation at the thought of returning to the water. Been ready for weeks, just waiting for the fish. Their first fishing trip in late April was a modest affair, a day excursion to a spot on the Eklutna River that Michael knew well. Dan moved more cautiously along the riverbank than he would have before the attack, testing each step before committing his weight to it. His first cast felt like coming home, the rod an extension of his arm, the line arcing perfectly over the yaw. Water. They caught nothing that day, but that wasn't the point. For Dan, it was about reclaiming an essential part of himself, proving that the bear had taken his boat and his cabin, but not his identity as a fisherman. As spring turned to summer, Dan settled into a new routine. He fished regularly, sometimes with Michael, sometimes alone. He explored his new surroundings, gradually expanding his comfort zone. He spoke with Melissa weekly, their conversations easier now that they had found a balance between her concern and his independence. In late June, almost 9 months after the attack, Dan received a final update from Ranger Wilson. The grizzly had emerged from hibernation and had been observed fishing for salmon in a remote area of the park, showing no unusual aggression toward humans or other bears. Seems to have returned to normal bear behavior, Wilson reported. We're still monitoring, but so far so good. Dan found himself smiling at the news. Glad to hear it, he said sincerely. Bear deserves its life, just like I deserve mine. Wilson chuckled. You know, Porter, you've got a strange perspective for someone who nearly became bear lunch. Most attack victims I deal with don't end up rooting for the bear to live happily ever after. Dan considered this, trying to articulate something he'd come to understand during his long recovery. Not about rooting for the bear, he said finally. More about accepting that we're all just trying to survive out there. Bear was doing what bears do. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. After ending the call, Dan sat on his deck watching the evening light play on the distant mountains. His life now was different from what it had been before the attack, smaller in some ways, with his charter business gone and his mobility somewhat limited. But it was also richer in other aspects, with new friendships, a closer relationship, with his daughter, and a deeper appreciation for each day. People in Eagle River had begun to know him as the fisherman who survived the bear attack. When asked about it, Dan would shrug and say simply, "I'm the one that got away." The phrase had become something of a personal motto, a reminder that while the encounter had changed him, it had not defined him. As he sipped his coffee and watched the twilight deepen, Dan reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. A single misstep in the forest, a chance encounter with a wild creature defending its territory, these momentary events had altered the course of his life. Yet somehow, he had found his way to a new equilibrium, a different but satisfying existence. The scars on his back and the occasional twinge in his ankle would always remind him of the bear, a powerful force of nature that had nearly ended his story. But as Dan Porter sat watching the Alaska sky turn from blue to purple to star-studded black, he felt a sense of peace with how things had unfolded. He had survived, he had adapted, and in his own way, he had thrived. He was, truly, the one that got away.